All right, so let me turn the slideshow on. So we were talking about this last class. I want to just briefly rehash a little bit and then talk about, Habermas's other major contribution besides the idea of the public sphere, his idea of what he calls communicative action, which is interesting. But again, Habermas lays a lot of emphasis on the idea of the public sphere, right? To him, it is basically as important as any other foundation of democracy. It's important as a constitution. It's as important as voting. Without a public sphere, which again is sort of this sort of independent space for disseminating information and debating, that you really can't have a functioning democracy. Which of course is alarming because there's a good argument to be made. I think that we in fact don't have a functioning public sphere, or that the public sphere has essentially been corrupted by corporate power, which itself has kind of formed this kind of, symbiosis with government power. The line between public and private, the line between governments and corporations are very much blurred, I would say, right? And to the point where they're almost indistinguishable from each other. And I think, this graph here demonstrates, of course, the idea of money, lobbying, and all this sort of, corporate money that flows into the political process, which of course is important. But I think, and this is why, of course, people talk about, campaign finance, and issues like that, getting money out of politics, which are important, of course. But I think also there, to the extent in which, corporations and governments are more or less aligned with each other today, it has a lot to do with class as well, right? There's a kind of class solidarity between, government elites or political elites and corporate elites, right? I think that's fairly obvious. Generally speaking, these people go to the same schools, same colleges, they live in the same neighborhoods, affluent neighborhoods and stuff, whether in cities or suburbs. They get married to each other. They generally run in the same social circles, which of course is what class is, right? It's this sort of, commonality between people that exist at different levels of society. And that's why class is important, right? It's not just a part of, some kind of Marxist dogma or something like that. Class is important because it predicts, fairly accurately how people are going to act and behave under certain circumstances. So here again, the sort of, solidarity that exists between, government and corporations. I think that's fairly clear. And, again, even if you were to so-called get money out of politics, many politicians would probably still continue to identify with corporate elites because they see them as their people, basically, their kind of people. And again, many of them have a kind of social relationship or kind of, run in the same kind of social circles. Anyway, as that, impacts democracy, though, it's pretty bad, right? So the public sphere essentially becomes corrupted, right? And this is what Habermas means when he refers to the structural transformation of the public sphere. That essentially it becomes something that's kind of like a bottom-up phenomenon, right? It's a way of, again, communicating the demands of the people to the government. It's a way of providing accurate and reliable information about the government that is independent, of course, of government accounts and official sources. And so that function essentially becomes, it goes from sort of like a bottom-up thing to a top-down thing. It becomes a hierarchical relationship that essentially communicates the instructions from government and corporate elites to the people. It essentially becomes a tool of propaganda, which again is something that we talked about last class, right? One aspect of it, which I think is very important at all times, but very relevant now, of course, is how the the sort of corrupted public sphere, functions as a way of delivering war propaganda to people. But it goes beyond that, of course, beyond that as well, of course, right? And Habermas, sort of builds on Adorno and Horkheimer's idea of the culture industry, though I think in his account of things, the public sphere encompasses things like the news media and journalism and things like that, whereas the culture industry mostly focuses on mass culture, right? Movies and things like that, radio in their day, but television and how art exists as a form of mass culture. Habermas, encompasses that, but also focuses a lot more on the news media as well, which again, all of it becomes sort of a function of, or a means of delivering propaganda. And that includes both things like, the blatantly pro-war editorials written by leading news publications, some of which we've covered last class, particularly, in the role of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, or now, as we sort of stoke the war, for a coming conflict with Russia, which in and of itself, I think, is sort of like almost like a, the real, I think, coming conflict of the future will be between the United States and China, which probably poses much more of a threat to U.S. dominance than Russia does. I mean, Russia is in many ways kind of like a second-rate power in today's world. Its economy is nowhere near as large as China's, for example, or even, of course, the United States, or even many other countries. Its heyday probably was, during the Soviet era, and it's kind of a like I said, sort of like a second-rate power. China, though, is, I think, much more of a threat. It has a much larger economy. Its military is larger, although nowhere near as large as the U.S. military, of course. And if what we're seeing now is any indication, it's probably a safe bet that when the time comes and the media sort of kicks into overdrive, that they'll be able to basically brainwash a good portion, if not the majority, of people into supporting some kind of conflict with China, as it seems that many people support some conflict with Russia. Maybe. I mean, I don't know if anyone heard it, but there was a recent poll that was released, and I don't put a lot of emphasis on polls, at least not, if they're, like just like one poll. Maybe if you have like a lot of different sources and they all more or less say the same thing, that's something. But that people thought that Biden was being too soft on Putin. Did anyone else hear that? However, though, when it, and there was a majority of, support for that idea. But when it came to the question of, would you support, going to war with Russia or something like that, if it led to a nuclear conflict, that majority of support quickly evaporated, which is understandable, but kind of like, is this an example of people wanting to have their own cake and eat it too? Like, what do people think is going to happen? Like, how else can you be tougher on Putin other than doing something that would risk a war? So that seems like a very confused and bewildered response, which makes me think it probably is true, but that people think that Biden is somehow at the same time being too soft on Putin, but also don't want to do anything that would risk war with Russia. And again, I ask, well, like, what else are you supposed to do then? What else could Biden do to be tougher on Putin without risking a war with him? I don't really know. I'm sure those people don't know either. But I mean, in very little time, I mean, have gotten most of the American public to support this idea that Ukraine is this pure democracy that's being threatened by the evil Russian dictator who's committing war crimes and genocide and all this other stuff. And a lot of that is exaggerated or just blatantly not true. And it doesn't seem to matter, though, of course. And like I said, I mean, if that's any indication, then I would imagine it wouldn't be too hard to brainwash most people into supporting some kind of conflict with China in the future, even though that could turn into much larger conflict even. And you know, war propaganda is only one aspect of this, right? The overall, you know, emphasis, of course, is to sort of undermine resistance to capitalism, right? Is to get people to sort of, you know, acquiesce and essentially submit to this sort of, you know, capitalist order, even though it, you know, it concentrates wealth in the hands of very few people. It alienates people, which of course has been one of the themes that we've explored throughout the class, and various other things, as well as, you know, creates environmental catastrophes, which we're dealing with now. It creates a international arena where the world is, you know, constantly on the brink of going to war. So there are, you know, many other you know, negative aspects of that as well. But that is, you know, essentially, you know, the function, the role that the media plays, right? Is essentially, you know, like brainwash people into being passive for the most part. And yeah, I mean, that definitely seems to be the overall trend. Now, you know, as far as war, as far as foreign policy relates to capitalism and things like that, I mean, these two things are not necessarily distinct from each other either. I mean, you know, our foreign policy is largely done at the behest and to sort of advance the interests of American corporations and possibly other corporations that are allied with the United States. You know, in World War I, Woodrow Wilson declared that the U.S. had to go to war to make the world safe for democracy, which of course was a, you know, bullshit claim, basically. A more truer claim would be to basically make the world safe for corporations. I mean, that is essentially what American foreign policy is all about. It's sort of, you know, spreading the expansion of capitalism, you know, particularly through, you know, American corporations across the world, securing markets, securing resources that they may need, you know, stifling governments that sort of, you know, oppose that kind of thing. I mean, that is essentially what American foreign policy is. So those things are not distinct from each other, you know, foreign policy and capitalism, or the resistance to capitalism, both of which are sort of, you know, undermined by the media. What else did I want to say about that? Yeah, and you know, I mean, we covered some of the war propaganda last class, right? I mean, we talked about this, these very crude drawings in the 1940s and afterwards, Superman's power to turn into racist stereotypes, because people often, you know, accuse people who critique the media of being too general. I specifically focused in on a number of articles, you know, particularly from the New Yorker magazine, which supported the cause for war in 2003. I think people are much more, you know, familiar with the role that you know, newspapers like the New York excuse me, like the New York Times and the Washington Post played. Maybe not as well known though are, you know, again, other so-called liberal publications like the New Yorker, which sort of, you know, prides itself on this sort of, you know, highbrow, you know, cultural, you know, image of being, you know, sophisticated and things like that. Not that sophisticated, unfortunately. You know, if you let yourself get tricked by, you know, George Bush and his people, you know, how smart are you really? It's a fair question, I think. And you know, you see these trends play out in many other ways. One of the more, you know, ridiculous, you know, line of arguments I see in a lot of articles are, you know, articles specifically geared towards millennials and, you know, younger people, which I've already, you know, mentioned last class, and I think everyone probably already knows already, you know, have very low, you know, little trust in American institutions. And I've seen, you know, several articles. I don't have any examples here, but I mean, they're easy enough to find. You know, like people saying things like, you know, what are you millennials so upset about? You know, you have cell phones, things like that, as if that is supposed to be a compensation for, you know, everything. You know, the lack of basic human rights, which we've already talked about. Again, a world that's constantly on the brink of war, impending environmental catastrophe. The idea that we can post pictures of ourselves on social media as a compensation for all those other things is ridiculous. And yet there's a number of articles that you can find that make arguments like that. It kind of gives you a sense of the kind of just garbage that's, you know, produced by the media in this country. And again, I have to emphasize, that these are people who probably go to very, you know, prestigious schools, get high paying jobs, working for some kind of media publication and or outlet and things like that. And this is the kind of crap that they, create. Doesn't say much for the, state of media in this country. Anyway, I talked about, Habermas himself has had, his fair share of questionable stances, let's say. He did at least oppose the invasion of Iraq in 2003, but he supported the 1991 Gulf War, which was also basically, started on false premises, right? I played, an example of the Naira testimony, this blatant lie made up by this girl who's the daughter of a Kuwaiti ambassador, that, the Iraqis were taking kids off of incubators and babies off of incubators and things like that. Total blatant lie. And yet that was used, repeatedly by George Bush and by other people in the sort of lead up to the US, involvement in that war in 1991. Habermas supported the bombing of Serbia in 1999. He has written, positively of the neoliberal Macron government in France, who's derisively referred to by people as the president of the rich by the French people. So it doesn't say that much, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit more. But I think this is more or less where we left off last class. We're starting to address the very low levels of trust that people have in the media in this country. And oftentimes this is framed in terms of partisan bias Republicans, let me move my camera over here so I can see this better. Republicans in particular have very low levels of trust in the media, only 10%, according to this poll from Gallup in 2020. Democrats, where you can see, have always had somewhat higher trust in the media than Republicans. Has been somewhat lower in the past, but pretty high according to this poll, which, frankly, I don't think says much for the critical thinking skills of Democrats or people that vote Democratic. Independents, which actually make up the largest group of voters in this country, believe it or not. Most people kind of just sort of ping pong back and forth between both parties in elections. Also very, very low levels of trust in media, only 36%, according to this. However, you can frame it other ways as well. You can look at it in terms of age demographics, which also shows you that younger people tend to have much lower levels of trust in the media than older people. Again, I don't think that's particularly surprising. I found when I was looking for some of these, charts online, it seemed that most of the time people, prefer to frame it in terms of parties rather than in terms of age. And I think that's because, I'm only speculating here, but I think the sort of underlying subtext is it's a way of sort of reassuring Democratic voters. It's a way of saying like, okay, well, people don't trust the media, but don't worry, it's mostly just those, crazy Republican people. Don't worry yourself about it. And I think when you, frame it in terms of age, not necessarily in terms of party alliance or anything like that, it kind of gives you a different view on things, right? It kind of tells you that, older people who tend to be a little more comfortable, a little more complacent, people who largely grew up during the Cold War and have already ingested a lot of this Cold War propaganda and stuff like that, tend to be much more sort of, willing to believe, official sources rather than younger people. I think it's also because of the, living standards of younger people are much more perilous than older people, where, if you were a baby boomer, particularly if you were white, you generally had a pretty, comfortable, not everyone, of course, but you generally had a pretty comfortable, standard of living throughout, at least most of your childhood and even probably into your adult years as well. You're probably able to buy a house when a house was, a lot cheaper than it is now and things like that. So it's not totally surprising that older people will be a little more trusting of media because they're generally speaking a little more comfortable, and I guess that comfort also breeds complacence as well. So here's another sort of breakdown, again, based on age, but also where people sort of turn to get their current events, as it says here, to stay informed about current events. And again, a lot of emphasis is placed on this, that younger people here, very young people, age 15 to 24, so even including people who are too young to vote, almost the majority get their news from social media. And again, this is often, sort of, portrayed in a way, I think, to sort of discredit or undermine the opinions of younger people, almost like saying, like, look, these people don't really know what they're talking about. They're getting their news off Facebook or whatever. You can't really take that seriously. And frankly, to a certain extent, I agree with that. I don't think that social media is a good place to get news from. I'm not a fan of social media. I'm not on any social media. I think it's generally a waste of time. I know people, people whose opinions I, value are on social media, and I think, it can possibly be beneficial in some ways, but I strictly, personally speaking, I don't find much use for it. And I do think there is a lot of bad information out there. I mean, there is a lot of, crazy shit that basically gets circulated around there. However, if you look at among people ages 40 and up, almost the same amount of people get their news off of television, which I mean, frankly, I could say is hardly any better than getting your news off of social media. Generally speaking, the quality of news on TV is much lower, much more sort of dumbed down, basically, than where you would get it otherwise. And in other words, if you want to be informed about things, you really have to read things. You have to actually read articles, but particularly from news outlets that you actually trust. I'm not saying read the New York Times necessarily. And as you can see here, newspapers, of course, make up the lowest, well, not, excluding, the category of none, of course, but newspapers make up the lowest category, right? I mean, combined ages, the both age groups mentioned here, only make up about 10%, right, of people that actually get their news from newspapers. Whereas again, social media and television basically make up, the majority for everything else. Small amount get their news from online news sites, which I actually think are probably better than a lot of newspapers. I was surprised, in an interview with Noam Chomsky, who's, again, pretty well known for, co-writing the book Manufacturing Consent, which is very critical of the media. It's kind of an older book. It came out in the 1980s. Chomsky still reads the New York Times. He still regards it as, I think he even said it, the best newspaper in the world. Which I have to say I don't, agree with, and I'm not putting myself on the same stature as Noam Chomsky, of course, but I do wonder if maybe, I mean, he's a guy in his 90s. I wonder if a lot of that opinion is sort of, fueled by his age, habit. I mean, there weren't many alternatives, right, to reading a newspaper for many years, only up until the last, let's say, 20 years or so, right? Maybe at most 25 years. Is where you see sort of, news sources developing online. I think Democracy Now!, which I've, linked to videos a couple times. I mean, I think only dates back to around 1996 or something like that. And that's among the oldest of all sort of online news sites. I mean, many of them are much more recent than that. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure if you parse through the New York Times or if you parse through the New Yorker or anything like that, I'm sure you'll find worthwhile content to read. But it's kind of hard to ignore, right? Their horrible takes and interpretations of very important events. It's also hard to ignore the fact that those are the articles that usually receive much more of a higher profile on these publications than others. For example, I quoted a little bit of that Michael Tomasky article on the New York Review of Books. I mean, that was their featured article, for that issue. And it's, I mean, one of the lamest things I ever read. I mean, he starts off by quoting a bunch of, economics statistics, which are very unconvincing, which really speak to how out of touch people come off when they just quote data. And several of them, like the idea that like, people's, standard of living has gotten, better under the Biden administration is clearly false. I mean, wages have actually gone down when you factor in, the massive growth of inflation over the last year. So, and his only, criticism of Biden was the, withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, that was their featured article. And it's crap, basically. So I'm sure if you parse through these things, you could find some worthwhile stuff. Personally, if anyone's interested in my recommendations, I read the World Socialist website almost every day. They're sort of like a daily news website obviously from a socialist point of view. There are a few other publications I read that are published, like monthly, so it's not as up to date. But the World Socialist website, publishes new articles every day, and they pretty much perform the role of a newspaper. They give you, day-to-day coverage. Do I agree with everything that they say? No, but mostly I tend to agree with their, interpretations of things. I would easily recommend that over the New York Times or, most other media publications. There's been a lot of talk about the growth of independent media, particularly on the internet. Things like the Young Turks and things like that. I don't really, put a lot of, emphasis on them either. I think mostly they're kind of, identifying themselves, or, a term I hate to use, but branding themselves as being sort of an alternative to the corporate media and things like that. But mostly they're kind of the same thing, which is that, they're sort of an extension of the Democratic Party. Most of their content is just bashing the Republicans and making the Republicans look stupid, which isn't hard to do, and is true, but is also, I think, kind of like the lowest level of political commentary that you can give. Yes, the Republicans are awful. Any sensible person knows that. Any person who's even remotely well informed about things should know that. But the Democrats are horrible too. They may hide it a little bit better than the Republicans, but at the end of the day, they still serve the same kind of corporate agenda that the Republican Party serves. So there's very little difference. It's essentially impossible in our current system, to vote against the interest of Wall Street, to vote against the interest of the Pentagon and the military, or the military industrial complex, as people like to call it. Term that was coined by Dwight Eisenhower, by the way, in his farewell address. But that's true. No matter what party you support, you really can't vote against those interests. So I think that's a much bigger problem than simply pointing out how dumb and fanatical and authoritarian many of the Republicans are, which of course I agree with. But I think there's a lot more to it than that. And again, I think a lot of the so-called independent media basically just serves that role. They're just there to sort of give you the illusion basically of a real alternative, but basically they're just there to kind of sort of funnel you back into the Democratic Party and just vote blue no matter who, vote for the lesser of two evils and all that, which I don't really agree with anymore. I did when I was younger, when I was your age, when I was a college student. I voted for John Kerry. Thinking, I was voting for the lesser of two evils, and then, much like what people said about Trump, Bush is this, horrible threat, and needs to be stopped. Of course, it didn't work. But I don't agree with that anymore, and I haven't done it. I don't think I voted for a Democrat probably since 2012, maybe 2014. I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. I didn't vote for Joe Biden in 2020. I didn't vote for Trump, obviously. I voted third party, and I'm just not going to support that party anymore, because I think they're again almost as bad or almost equally as bad as the Republican Party. And for people who think vote blue, vote for the lesser of two evils and things like that, keep in mind that your vote will be sort of used against you. For example, I remember someone saying for the Biden campaign in 2020, sort of addressing the popularity of, Sanders. If Sanders ran, I would have voted for him. that, a lot of people think we want, radical change in this country. Well, they quoted the number of people that voted for Hillary in 2016, 63 million people, or, whatever it is, 63 million people, shows that, that they don't want radical change, which of course is bullshit. A lot of people voted for Hillary Clinton who do want radical change in this country, but they voted for her because, they went in for this, vote for the lesser of two evils argument. So keep that in mind, right? When you vote for the lesser of two evils, that they'll use your vote as evidence in the next election cycle to show you that people want the same old stuff. They want the establishment, that they don't want significant changes to occur. And, personally speaking, I mean, I just don't want to be a part of that. I don't want my vote to be used in that way. Anyway, I mean, voting is very overrated in this country. I don't mean to say that the idea of voting itself is not important, because it is, but with our electoral college and with all the various, undemocratic institutions that we have, it really, significantly undermines your vote. I mean, I voted third party, fully knowing that, of course, that, since the electoral votes are all that really matters, that the Democratic candidate was, virtually guaranteed to win all the electoral votes from the state that I live in, which of course is New Jersey. And of course they did. So I knew that. But anyway, so, I mean, the fact that more and more people, especially younger people, are sort of tuning out of the media, I think is kind of a healthy thing. I actually think that the low levels of trust in the media are kind of a healthy thing for the most part. I mean, not as if not if you believe in, QAnon and crazy stuff like that. But why should you believe the media, which is so often lied to people about, so many things, some of which I'll cover in a moment. But, I think it's fairly well known at this point. Well, all right, so let's turn to that. So there's basically, my PowerPoint not working. Okay. So here's a sort of a brief list of, major things that the media has gotten wrong on basically since 2000. I'm sure there's more that you could add to this list. I'm sure there's many other, and I'm sure I could probably spend like a whole class talking about, any one of these things. But I'll try to run through it pretty quickly, in no particular order. But downplaying the theft of the election in 2000, George Bush stole that election. It's pretty obvious, but kind of just went along with it. Didn't act like it was a major illegal action, basically, and something which basically should have been overturned. I mean the sort of blatant illegality of it, and the just the shadiness of it is really remarkable. And really, Bush is not, was not a legitimate president. I mean, he was a guy who's essentially installed into the presidency by the Supreme Court, by the conservative Supreme Court. But not only did he lose the popular vote, which everyone knows, but he should have lost the electoral vote as well. But the Democrats didn't really do anything about it. The media didn't really do anything about it. They kind of downplayed it, and probably because they were afraid of a mass uprising of people. But that's certainly important. And say what you will about Trump. I mean, Trump did lose the popular vote by a significant majority of votes, millions of votes. But no one can really say that he didn't, win the electoral college, which is probably a good reason why we should not have an electoral college. But is that the one Alexander asked with Chads in the voting booth? Yes, it is. The hanging Chads and all this other stuff. And they were doing a recount, and then the Supreme Court intervened, stopped the recount, and then afterwards, issued another ruling saying that, well, now it's too late to do a recount, so we just have to go by the original result. And I mean, that's just like the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, I could probably spend an entire class just talking about the theft of the election in 2000, but it is very important. Here's another one which is interesting, which I don't know if people remember much anymore, but the Clear Channel memo after 9/11. So what this was, and let me switch over here. Internet. So following the September 11th attacks in 2001, Clear Channel, which is now called iHeartMedia, which is the largest owner of radio stations in the United States, circulated a memo basically suggesting certain songs not be played. And people try to, have the sort of mealy mouth, excuse, well, they didn't give an outright ban on the songs, which of course is true because rarely anything is ever actually formally censored. But there's this sort of, informal suggestions and things like that, which essentially take the force of a ban, even if it's not, officially a ban. Anyway, it's just kind of interesting to look at it because it's quite extensive. As it says, it contains 165 songs, some of which I'll go over. And I mean, some of the titles are pretty ridiculous. Hell's Bells by AC/DC, Highway to Hell. And songs that mention, does it mention the criteria? It's like anything that mentioned like fire or destruction as well as religion were essentially banned. And I'm not gonna go through all of these, obviously. TNT, The Boy from New York City, When You're Falling, Down in a Hole, Rooster, Sea of Sorrow, Smooth Criminal, not by Michael Jackson, but by Alien Ant Farm, which is sort of like the pop punk cover of that song. What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong, which is a very uplifting song, of course, if you've never heard it. But people thought that was apparently inappropriate to play after 9/11. No Smoke Without a Fire, Walk Like an Egyptian, Falling for the First Time, Rescue Me, Sabotage, Sure Shot, several songs by the Beatles, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Opla Dee, Opla Da, Ticket to Ride, like an airplane ticket, I guess. I mean, it's funny the lengths that they go to include anything which could even in the vaguest way remind people of what happened on September 11th. Hit Me With Your Best Shot, Love Is a Battlefield, Burning for You, Smoking, Black is Black, Rock the Casbah by The Clash, Wonderful World by Sam Cooke, another R&B singer. Well, Louis Armstrong was jazz. Fire Woman, Mac the Knife, The End of the World, America, Knocking on Heaven's Door, both versions, right? The Bob Dylan version and the Guns N' Roses version. Hey Man, Nice Shot, Learn to Fly, You Dropped the Bomb on Me. So, I mean, it's, absurd. But, I mean, it shows you, I mean, I've already made this point before in prior class. I mean, American culture is among the most heavily censored cultures in the world. Certainly among any other country, which could reasonably be considered or formally categorized as a democratic government or a democratic society. It's an extremely censored culture. And we've already talked about this in many other instances: movies, comic books, music, video games. And here you see this very, overreaching, excessive list of, banned songs. They don't want to call it a band, but these songs were banned, basically. You weren't going to hear them on the radio. Benny and the Jets, Rocket Man. We didn't get to my favorite one yet. Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven. That's not it. Imagine by John Lennon, which has lyrics about, imagine if there was no religion in the world or anything like that. So anything that referenced fire or religion or anything like that was basically banned. Dancing in the Street, Metallica, several of their songs. Where is it? Rage Against the Machine, all songs. every song by Rage Against the Machine was basically banned after 2001 for, a period of time. Queen, Another One Bites the Dust, Killer Queen, Aeroplane by Red Hot Chili Peppers. So, I mean, does anyone else think this is excessive? I mean, does anyone think this is kind of like treating people like their children, basically? Like we can't listen to these songs because it might stir up unpleasant feelings or or something like that. I just think this is, ridiculous, and probably not as bad as some of the other things that are on my little list of, media failings. But I think it's absurdity. Again, it's overreaching and excessiveness. It certainly, deserves to be on this list as well. Bruce Springsteen, "I'm on Fire," "Fell on Black Days" by Soundgarden. Well, there it is. Of course, you have Russiagate, and this is a big one, right? I mean, this is, again, much more consequential in many ways, but you had the media for like what, 3 or 4 years going on and on and on about a conspiracy hatched by Vladimir Putin. And if you think about where we are now, today with Russia, you can't help but think that this plays a role in the amplifying of, tensions and this sort of drive to war, which, I mean, I'm not sure that the US won't eventually take a more active hand in this conflict. I mean, we're currently arming Ukraine to the teeth, basically, where we're just pouring, massive amounts of weapons into this country, probably many of which are ending up in the hands of neo-Nazis and things like that. Not to say that every person in the Ukraine is a neo-Nazi, but there are elements within the Ukrainian military. And that's been a longstanding thing too, by the way. I mean, during World War II, many Ukrainians supported the Nazis when they, invaded the Soviet Union. So you have weapons, going in there. We've been doing this since 2014, by the way, as well. So there's a long sort of, provocation there by arming Ukraine. But anyway, I mean, after the election of 2016, the media spent like 3 or 4 years basically making all these unfounded accusations that Russia somehow hacked our elections and somehow caused Donald Trump to become president of the United States. And you have to remember that was what the claim that was being made, that without Russian interference, Donald Trump would not have become president of the United States. That's a pretty strong claim to make. And of course, there's never been any evidence produced to show that. In fact, many of the people who were making these allegations, people outside of the media, are now on trial for perjury, for lying on their oath. And again, just, no evidence has ever been found to really substantiate those claims. Do I believe that Vladimir Putin probably wanted Donald Trump to become president? He probably did. I mean, especially since, Hillary Clinton wanted to go to war with Russia over Syria. I'm not surprised that he probably wanted Trump to become president. Did he believe that Trump would make the American empire look kind of dumb? That he would sort of, expose American empire, in a way by, having this incompetent, corrupt businessman running it? Yeah, probably. Agent said, but then they never talk about the total number of votes for Biden. You mean that Biden got more votes than he should have, or actually cast for him? Suppose he got an extra 8 million. Yeah, right. Which is the most a presidential candidate has ever gotten. Trump got about 70 million in 2020, and Biden was, I think close to 80 million, but maybe it was more like 78 million, something like that. I mean, as far as I know, that's a legitimate election. I mean, Trump obviously doesn't think so, but nobody's taking what he says seriously. You're saying that if Russia was interfering in the election, why didn't they interfere again to get Biden to get Trump re-elected in 2020? Well, yeah, I mean, that would be a good question. Although I don't think that they could, obviously, right? Which is, I think the point you're trying to make. I mean, let me know if I'm getting that wrong, but something like that. But and just the relentlessness of it for years. I mean that has to be emphasized as well. Matt Taibbi, one of the few, I think, somewhat credible journalists left here in the United States, compared this, in fact, to the sort of the run up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and took a lot of flack for that. Took a lot of negative feedback for that. And I could understand why people would take that stance, because obviously the run up, the massive propaganda leading up to the war of Iraq led to a war, an actual war, which is, killed probably at least 1 million people, if not more, if not 2 million people, and not to mention refugees and wounded people and things like that. Whereas, nothing as consequential came out of Russiagate so far. I mean, like I said, let's see how things play out, in this current conflict. But what I think his point was is that just the sheer relentlessness of it. I mean, leading up, in 2002, 2003, this is all you ever heard about. Saddam having weapons of mass destruction. And it was just taken for granted by everybody in the media, basically. People who were essentially pushed out. That's something I didn't even mention before. But the talk show host, Phil Donahue, was fired by NBC because he was like an anti-war voice. Jesse Ventura, the former pro wrestler turned political commentator, he was fired as well. They couldn't even handle criticism from Jesse Ventura, in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. Not to say anything bad about Jesse Ventura. I think he's, I don't know, an interesting guy. But I think that's the point that he's trying to make. Just the sheer relentlessness of the media and pushing this narrative day in, day out. And in this case, Russiagate's even longer. We're talking like 3 or 4 years versus like a year, or maybe even like half a year or something like that. And the only thing that really seemed to stop it was when COVID hit. I mean, this is why I say about 4 years, from like 2016, basically up until, or was it 2015, basically up until 2020, as far as I can recall. I mean, it was basically, those claims are going right up until then. And again, nothing has ever materialized to show that that is true. I mean, what's the evidence that they have that some Russian guy spent $100,000 on ads on Facebook or something like that, who may or may not be connected to the Russian government? They've never even been able to prove that. And $100,000 on ads is nothing. Do you want to see what these ads were like? I actually include a couple of examples. It was like things like this, like this is the sophisticated propaganda campaign that Russia was running to get Donald Trump elected. I mean, who could possibly be swayed by this? Like, if you want Jesus to win, and showing them in like a boxing match or something like that, or some sort of ultimate fighting thing, Hillary in red with horns coming out of her head. I mean, you would have to have some kind of brain damage to be swayed by something like this. And maybe that accounts for a significant amount of, the Christian right in this country. But they were all voting for Trump anyway. I think 80% of, so-called evangelicals, voted for Trump. These holier than thou people who, are repressive about everything, voted for a, sleazy, corrupt businessman who brags about, sleeping with porn stars and things like that. Doesn't matter to them, but anyway, I mean, like, how could anyone be swayed by this? By the army of Jesus? Today, Americans are able to elect a president with godly moral principles. Hillary is a Satan, and her crimes and lies had proved just how evil she is. And even though Donald Trump isn't a saint by any means, he's at least an honest man and cares deeply for his country. My vote goes for him. Satan, if I win, Clinton wins. Jesus, not if I can help it. Press like to help Jesus win. These were the kind of things that were running on Facebook. $100,000 on ads for things like this. That's what got Donald Trump elected president. I'm sorry, that's not, that's bullshit. Come on, everyone should know that. And what else? That the Russian hacker that gave emails, the Hillary Clinton emails to Julian Assange, what may or may not have been a Russian, hacker or something like that. Again, never been proven. And the real story is that what's in those emails, right? Which is one of the other points that I'm going to bring up. But I mean, those emails basically show that the 2016 primary was rigged. It was basically rigged against Bernie Sanders. My favorite one of those is Jesus holding Trump's hand and leading him to the White House. Oh, I don't think I saw that one, but yeah, I mean, that would certainly fit in with this. I mean, it's absurd. Again, like, what kind of person would actually be swayed by something like that? Who isn't already probably, made up their mind to vote for Donald Trump anyway. So, I mean, that's the kind of evidence that they have. And the so-called Podesta emails. Do you know how they actually got those emails? Podesta, who was like Clinton's campaign manager or something like that, basically fell for one of those email phishing schemes. Do you ever get these emails? I get them all the time, right? Someone sends you an email saying that your password is about to expire or your email is filled up. Click here to reset your password or something like that. And usually it's pretty obvious. I gotta say I've never fallen for one of those things. I'm not the most tech savvy person in the world, but I mean usually they're fairly obvious. Sometimes they're kind of clever, but I've still never fallen for any of them. Podesta did. He clicked on it, and you never should, by the way, because these are people basically trying to rob you. And I don't know what happens when you click on it, but I guess somehow they get your password, and then they can get into your email and things like that. That's how they got his emails, which revealed all this shadiness going on in the 2016 primary. It hardly sounds like this, sophisticated, hacking operation the way the media portrayed it to be. It sounds like an old guy that doesn't know how to use a computer, basically falling for the easiest, to recognize scams since the internet has been around. So, and again, more importantly, those emails are true, and they basically exposed the 2016 primary as being a sham, and that's it. And that's the only evidence that they have, essentially. I mean, I'll be honest, I never really followed the story all that closely because I always thought it was bullshit from day one. I guess I must be fairly immune to propaganda because I never believed the weapons of mass destruction stuff, and I never believed this stuff even for a second. But a lot of people did, and it just went on for years and years and years. And they gave themselves awards, Pulitzer Prizes for their coverage of this, New York Times' coverage over Russia interference in the elections. It's like, what Russian interference? I'm like, you're giving yourself an award for something that didn't happen, for your coverage of something that did not happen. Anyway, and all these things are very much, or a lot of these things are, like related in some ways. The constant smearing of Julian Assange, an actual journalist who's actually doing, again, what we would expect the public sphere to do, providing independent information about the doings of government across the world, not just the United States. Either attacking this guy or just basically not talking about it. I mean, right now, and again, I don't know how many people are aware of this or are following it. I mean, this guy's essentially on trial for his life. And it's been a long process too. And there's a good chance that he'll be, extradited to the United States and have to stand trial here. Which, at the very least, I think would make it a little bit harder to ignore the story. But I mean, right now he's on trial in the United Kingdom, and it's barely even talked about. Probably the most important trial in decades. I hate when people say, "Oh, the trial of the century" and all this, hyperbolic stuff. But I mean, certainly an important trial. I would be hard pressed to think of a more important one. And again, hardly even talked about. And when they do talk about them, they usually, try to, character assassination, stuff like that. Rape allegations, which turned out to be untrue, and like stuff like that. Constant smearing of Bernie Sanders and his supporters, the so-called Bernie Bros, right, for being racist and sexist and all that other stuff. I mean, what's that based upon? That there are maybe some toxic people on the internet, who may support Bernie Sanders. I'm sure that's true, but it's true for everybody. I mean, like when people say this, it's like, have you just discovered the internet? I mean, that's what the internet is. It's people just being toxic and attacking people, with the virtue of anonymity and things like that. To single out one group of people and act like they're the only ones doing that. It's just absurd. And again, and they make it out to sound like Bernie Sanders supporters are going around, like beating up people and spray painting, swastikas on buildings and stuff like that. I mean, there's no analog to this in the real world, right? I mean, that never happened. Nothing like that has ever happened. Sanders, by all accounts, had the largest and most diverse group of supporters among any candidate by far. The most, raised more money than any other candidate. Raised money based on small donations, didn't depend on corporate financing and things like that. And Sanders himself, I mean, do you remember that comment that Elizabeth Warren said about him, which he denies, saying that she claims that he said that a woman could never beat Donald Trump. And then, even though it's literally just a case of he said, she said, the rest of the media treated it as if it was like an established fact, I mean, like without even questioning it. So those are just some of the examples of things like it, and they tried to slander him that he, supported Marxist governments in Nicaragua and things like that. And just, like absurd things like that. Downplaying the corruption of the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primary. 2016 Democratic primary, very, very, very corrupt. Again, those emails show that to be the case. The 2021, very much so as well. Remember all that shadiness during the Iowa caucus, the shadow app, which was apparently created by a Democratic donor, somebody high up in the Democratic Party. Politics, particularly in these elections, are very momentum based. Excuse me. In other words, being perceived as a winner gives you more momentum going into the next contest. Bernie Sanders won the Iowa caucus, or at least he received the most votes. Apparently he got less delegates, but got more votes overall. But by all that shadiness and surrounding that, denied him the momentum that he should have had, basically going into the next contest, which he won. He won the next one and the one after that. Sanders is the only Democratic nominee, probably the only presidential nominee ever to win the first three primaries and then go on to lose the nomination. It's never happened before. Usually you don't win that many. Barack Obama didn't, in 2008. It's very rare, in fact, to win that because Iowa and New Hampshire are different states, different demographics. That's part of the rationale for holding these primary contests when they do. It's the first candidate to win, not only the first two, but the first three and go on to lose the nomination. Obama played a big role in that, getting candidates to drop out of the election right before the big Super Tuesday primary, which is, where a bunch of states have their primaries all in the same day. California, that was the first time that California was included among the Super Tuesday primaries. And I'm not suggesting that is necessarily a conspiracy, but I mean, Bernie Sanders won the California primary and nobody even talked about it. I mean, the biggest state in the country in terms of population. He won that and completely downplayed the significance of it because it was overshadowed by all the other states, even though they're obviously much smaller. And then when Joe Biden, leading up to that, won the South Carolina primary, a small state, which has a 0% chance of voting for the Democrat in the general election. When he won that, they act like it was like the biggest thing in the world, right? And gave him all the momentum leading up to the Super Tuesday primary. So there's a lot of shadiness surrounding both primaries, I would say. The Caliphate podcast. Again, also, I'll switch back here to Wikipedia, good old Wikipedia, because I would imagine this is probably maybe something that's not that well known, but this is a podcast from 2018, sponsored by the New York Times or published by the New York Times, which feature this guy who used the name Abu Husaifa al-Kanadi, whose real name was Shiroz Chowdhury, who basically claimed to be a part of ISIL and claimed to have, killed people and things like that. Was interviewed, 12 times, I think, by the New York Times, by this reporter, Rukmini Callimachi. Long story short, it turned out to be a total fake. Made all this shit up. He was arrested by the Canadian government or by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for lying about participating in terrorist activities. Following his arrest, the New York Times admitted to a severe editorial failing and retracted Chowdhury's story. So again, and this thing won awards, received the Peabody Award, finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. It's all bullshit. It's all made up. I mean, do they have anyone doing fact checking there at the New York Times? Embarrassing, to say, to say the very least. Last class, like I said, I played a bit of that Naira testimony, which is also fabricated. I mean, how do I know that it's fake? Besides the fact that everyone agrees that it was fake. I mean, organizations back then, like Amnesty International, originally supported this idea, supported this story and supported this woman, and then later retracted that when it emerged that there was no evidence at all to corroborate what she was saying. There's no documented evidence to show that Iraqi soldiers took babies off of incubators. So groups that originally supported her were eventually forced to retract the story and basically, acknowledge this is made up. So, not the first time that you've heard something like this. All right. Back to PowerPoint. Unwavering support for U.S. imperialism and allies, as we've already talked about. Saudi Arabia and Israel, very much a double standard there, especially now as we're seeing what's playing out with the Ukraine and Russia. Saudi Arabia has killed, I probably mentioned this before, but Saudi Arabia has killed almost 500,000 people in Yemen. Nobody talks about it. Nobody in the mainstream talks about it. Every time a Palestinian kid throws a rock at an Israeli soldier, the government responds by leveling, entire neighborhoods in the Gaza Strip. Nobody talks about it. Or if they do, they usually defend Israel and say that they're justified for doing that. So I can see I'm starting to run out of time here. So let me move a little bit faster. But most of these things I have mentioned at some point before. Failing upwards, again, like in the case of Jeffrey Goldberg, but many other people, no matter how badly these people report on things, no matter how many times their stories are shown to be untrue or exaggerated, there doesn't seem to be any accountability. Nobody loses their job. Nobody gets fired. Again, I'm not calling for the death penalty on these people, but if you got those stories so badly wrong, something that resulted in the deaths of 1 million people, you shouldn't be a journalist anymore. I mean, simply put, or at least have to sort of work your way back up again. Goldberg got essentially promoted, became an editor of the Atlantic, which is another important political magazine here in the United States. Recently features an article by Bill Clinton, trying to justify NATO expansion, which is a major, provocative factor, leading up to the war with Russia and Ukraine, trying to put a positive spin on it, which is, read the article yourself, I guess, and see if you're convinced by it. But I don't think it's a convincing account. And of course, the expansion of NATO since the end of the Cold War is a major factor in this war. Horrible takes on Democrats losing or nearly losing recent elections for being, quote unquote, too radical. Terry McAuliffe in Virginia, for example. Our own beloved governor, Phil Murphy, here in New Jersey, that they were perceived as being too far left. And that's why they, in Murphy's case, almost lost. A state that's, generally considered to be a blue state. Is that the reason why? Or is it because they're, out of touch millionaires who don't, do anything to improve people's lives, which is what politicians are supposed to do. McAuliffe is a longtime Democratic Party insider, was part of the Clinton campaign going back to the 1990s, millionaire real estate developer. Murphy is a Goldman Sachs, I think, Wall Street guy. I mean, to portray these people as being like radical is a joke. Anyway, I won't spend too much time on that because, like I said, I'm starting to run out of time here. And of course, last but not least, proclaiming the end of the pandemic at least 3 times already and counting. And as I say this, from what I've read, cases are going up again because of this new variant or sub variant that's out there now. Again, hardly ever talked about anymore. I read an article from a couple of weeks ago saying the U.S. now officially passed 1 million COVID deaths. Nobody's really been talking about that. You would almost think that this, war with Russia and the Ukraine was a way of, diverting people's attentions from the, horrible conditions here in the United States. But I guess that would be considered conspiratorial thinking or something like that. And I say at least 3 times. I mean, some people place it more than that. I'm basing it off of, right before the Delta wave hit and right before Omicron hit, at the end of the year. I mean, Delta was like less than a year ago too. Did people realize that? I mean, it was at the end of last summer, right? Going into fall of last year. So just in less than a year or less than a year ago, they've already, said that the pandemic was over and then had to walk that claim back. So I mean, anyway, going back to the, the original point, I mean, why do people have such low trust in the media? I would think a lot of it has to do with this. I mean, you tell me what you think, but I think it's, when you look at the sum total of all of this, it's hard to imagine otherwise. Again, I mean, the fact that 73% of Democrats still trust the media doesn't really say much for their, critical thinking skills. I don't think. Anyway, so the public sphere is only one part of, Habermas's contribution to, theory. His other idea, and really in many ways his bigger contribution, is this idea of communicative action. So the other reading, and I included 3 readings by Habermas, 2 basically dealing with the public sphere, and this one basically the last chapter of this massive book known as The Theory of Communicative Action, a 2-volume book, incredibly dense, probably the toughest. Well, yeah, even in this little excerpt, you could probably see it, but probably the densest reading of any of the readings that I've assigned this semester. And I'll try to explain it as best I can with the time that we have left. But there are some interesting ideas there. So, and Habermas in the chapter, the task for a critical theory of society, does give you kind of an overview of critical theory in the Frankfurt School, which might be helpful. Addresses things like the debate over mass culture between Adorno and Benjamin, for example, and things like that. But what Habermas is doing is essentially sort of, bridging outwards from where Horkheimer and Adorno were, and trying to sort of, build upon, but sort of, correct on some of the things that he thinks that they get wrong. So Habermas would essentially argue that Horkheimer and Adorno base their critical theory on the individual's consciousness, what he referred to as the philosophy of consciousness. And essentially, what they do is kind of paint themselves into a corner. If you remember, Adorno and Horkheimer are very pessimistic about any chances for, things to get better, leaving little room for an isolated individual confronted with a massive bureaucratic state and capitalist economic system. There's not much that you can do, right? Especially since they've essentially dismissed the working class. The working class is essentially now a part of the system or a part of the establishment, as they say, and Marcuse says as well, for that matter. Where do you go? For Adorno, it's things like art. The sort of the critical, potential sort of exists in genuine art, he says. Which, okay, well, what are you supposed to do with that? How do you build a movement around something like that? Doesn't really seem to leave you much leeway. And Habermas sort of, builds on this idea. Now, what's interesting about that is that Habermas does not, in fact, argue that we should go back to the working class or something like that. But what he does is he sort of moves from sort of the individual level of consciousness to language and communication. Or expressed in sociological terms, moving from the subjective to what he calls the intersubjective. And this concept of the intersubjective is interesting because it literally sort of fits between the subjective and objective, right? If objective is just sort of reality as it is, and the subjective is our own, sort of individual perceptions of things, the intersubjective is sort of knowledge which may not be sort of objectively factually true, but sort of like shared knowledge that people have, shared social knowledge, essentially. And so more and more he starts to look at communication. What sort of underlies communication and language? How do people communicate? What essentially makes communication possible? And he argues that when we communicate, we implicitly invoke what he calls validity claims as the basis of agreement. So in order to communicate with people, you have to have some notion of truth, essentially, or what you would have to do to convince somebody, or what you would have to do to form an agreement with somebody based upon what you say. So Habermas takes it for granted, of course, and I think it's probably true that when we communicate, of course, the implicit idea of communication is that you want to be understood by the other person, right? And ideally, you want the person to agree with what you're saying. So how do you come about that? How do you sort of form agreement with people? He says that there's sort of these sort of intrinsic sort of rules that govern how we communicate and what constitutes rational communication. He would also go on to say that a lot of this communication sort of happens unconsciously, or that a lot of it sort of happens, occurs in sort of background knowledge that we have, that we kind of just take for granted, right? We don't often question it or even think about it, but it sort of underlies our ability to communicate with other people. And sort of the sum total of these sort of background assumptions, these sort of linguistic relations that we enter into other people, he terms the life world, which I'll try to explain a little bit, both this idea of validity claims and life world briefly. But again, the life world is basically our sort of shared understanding of the world based in language. So there is kind of an emphasis or a bias maybe to people that sort of share a common language, that they're more likely to have a sort of shared understanding of things. But even that, it even sort of goes beyond that idea, right? Obviously, people who speak the same language oftentimes have different beliefs about things. And so then you go even further into it, sort of a shared culture, shared values. And again, so Habermas sort of places great importance on the fact that most of these things are sort of exist in the background. The people often don't question these things. And essentially what he wants to do is sort of bring these things out a little bit more, make these things a little more explicit. So first, this idea of validity claims, it sort of breaks it up into different categories, right? So there's at least three. This chart introduces a fourth one, but generally speaking, there's at least three, right? So you raise a sort of factual claim, right? Something which can be more or less scientifically verified. That, he says, is the validity claim of truth. And so, you either say something that's sort of factually true or factually untrue. And you can tell the difference. There's a way of sort of testing what a person is saying to determine if it is factually correct or factually incorrect. There's the idea of sincerity, that when a person says something, that they're being honest, that they actually mean what they're saying. So a person says something, they're either sincere or they're insincere, right? They don't actually mean what they're saying. They're saying it because they think it's what people want to hear, or they're doing it for their own, reasons, perhaps. But the point is that you can tell the difference between when a person's being sincere or not sincere or insincere. And that one, Habermas does say, is a little bit harder, right? It's oftentimes hard to tell if a person really means what they're saying or not. The other one, I'm kind of going out of order here, is the idea of legitimacy. So this really deals then with the realm of values and ethics and social norms and things like that. That when a person says something, that it is right or appropriate in light of existing norms or values. And so how do we determine whether something is legitimate or not? How do we determine whether something is sort of conforming to our sort of pre-established values about things? For Habermas, it's based on the notion of agreement. When we agree that something is the right thing to do, then it becomes the right thing to do. When there's a forced agreement, or when you exclude people from their ability to sort of, agree or disagree on things, then the sort of social norms and values that come out of that are not legitimate, he would say. So think about something like rights. We often talk about rights, civil rights, political rights, social rights, which are very limited here in the United States. Where do rights come from? Well, back in the day, they used to say that they came from God, which is kind of a very sort of lazy way of, basing a foundation of rights. They're God-given rights, which is not very convincing. The modern day way of looking at that is that we agree. We agree that people should have rights. We agree, at least on the notion of civil rights and things like that. Most other countries, have some kind of agreement on social rights, like healthcare and things like that. These things are much more controversial here in the United States. But I could argue, I think you could still make a good argument for why people should have social rights. They're essential for life. It's kind of hard to really imagine a person living life without healthcare and housing and a standard of living and things like that. So the idea being is that when people, and Habermas gives a lot of emphasis to this category, to the idea of social norms and values, right? I mean, factuality is more in the domain of science. Sincerity is more, harder to determine. Clarity is another thing that I don't think that was originally a part of what Habermas said. That was kind of added on later. But clarity is important. Habermas himself would probably fail the clarity test, essentially. And that's what these things do, is that they essentially give you a test for determining whether or not a statement made by a person is acceptable or not, is rational, essentially. But he gives a lot of emphasis to the importance of social norms and values. So when people disagree on social norms, they then enter a process of deliberation, where they give reasons for why they hold their point of view. So, people could disagree on the idea of social rights, for example, but I think they would have a hard time doing so. I mean, I think you would have a hard time arguing why healthcare is not essential for human life. And I think that's true. I mean, and I think that's why so many people kind of stay in their own sort of insulated world, right? Conservatives just watch Fox News, and liberals watch whatever, CNN or something like that, because they don't really want to have to be able be in a situation where they get sort of called upon their views and have to defend their views, because it's very hard to. I mean, how would you really make a convincing argument for why people should not have healthcare, or why healthcare is not essential basically for human life? I've always thought this would be an interesting exercise for students. I haven't gotten around to doing it just yet, but to sort of because this is a way of analyzing things, right? And sort of breaking things down. So you could take like a newspaper article or a political speech or something like that, and literally break it down statement by statement, sentence by sentence, and to determine if in a given statement, are they making a factual claim? Are they making a values-based claim? Those would be the two that are most important, and sort of testing, the basis of these statements. Is the factual claim, does it actually stand up to evidence? Does the moral claim, or does the values claim, is it actually based on something that people agree with, or are there people who disagree, who are being sort of forced out of the debate? I think that would be an interesting exercise for people to do something like that. Unfortunately, I guess we're going to have to leave it there. I mean, I'll pick up this next class and talk a little bit more about the life world, because it is, the life world and the system, his idea of how society works. Basically, it's sort of the combination of what he calls the life world and the social system being politics and economics, the life world being, again, culture and society, basically social integration, socialization of people, concepts that you would see often in a sociology class, for example. But we'll have to leave it there, and we'll pick that up next class. I see some people have already left, but okay. All right, so take care, everyone. Have a good week.
Thank you. Have a good week.
Take care.